So, I will be going over how chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is CTE, and how it's portrayed in relation to the NFL. Specifically, I'll be analyzing how mainstream media tends to frame CTE as an individual problem and focusing on personal stories and tragic outcomes, while the sociological research approaches it as a larger structural issue connected to the way that football is organized and played. By comparing these two perspectives, I'll show a flip, and I'll show how the sociological imagination helps us understand CTE as more than just a personal health issue, but a broader public problem. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, is a progressive brain disease caused by repeated head trauma over time. It is especially common in contact sports like football, where athletes experience repeated impacts, not just diagnosed concussions. These repeated hits lead to long-term brain damage, including the buildup of abnormal proteins called tau. They develop in the brain that slowly affect function. One important thing about CTE is that it can usually only be diagnosed after death, meaning players may live without knowing. Symptoms include memory loss, depression, mood swings, and difficulty with decision making. These symptoms often get worse over time and can severely impact daily life long after the career's end. This is important because CTE does not just affect health, it impacts NFL players during and after their careers. Over time, repeated head trauma has shown that it can lead to cognitive decline, emotional instability, and behavioral changes like aggression or depression. In some cases, these effects are linked to tragic outcomes such as suicide. Well-known cases like Junior Seau and Dave Duerson were both diagnosed with CTE after their deaths. These stories are often covered as individual tragedies, focusing on the personal life of the player. However, this framing can overlook the larger issue of how the sport itself contributes to repeated brain trauma. Because of this, CTE raises serious questions about long-term player safety and how the NFL manages head injuries. Overall, mainstream media tends to frame CTE as an individual tragedy. The focus is placed on personal stories, symptoms, and emotional or medical outcomes of former players. While the coverage helps raise awareness, it often avoids deeper discussion about the NFL's role in repeated head trauma. Instead, solutions usually focus on medical research, awareness, or diagnosing individuals after symptoms appear. From a sociological perspective, this is called a private trouble framing, where a broader public issue is presented as an individual problem rather than a system-wide one. Looking at specific cases, it shows the pattern clearly. Junior Seau, a former linebacker, died of suicide and was later diagnosed with CTE. Media coverage focused heavily on the personal tragedy rather than the structural issue of repeated head trauma. Dave Duerson also died by suicide and requested that his brain would be studied and was later found out to have CTE, but again, coverage focused mostly on the individual story and then the finding of having CTE. Steve McMichael was a former Chicago Bears player who was diagnosed with advanced CTE and also had ALS, which he eventually passed away from. His health decline and personal struggles were more of a structural case. His wife donated his brain and wanted to bring awareness to CTE and ALS. Aaron Hernandez is a major example. After his death, he had severe CTE found in his brain. Media focused on his criminal actions and explaining what he had gone through and done, and then ultimately taking his life, while the sociological research looks at the brain trauma and how they may have influenced his brain and his decision making. Other cases like Rudy Johnson and Doug Martin also appear in headlines tied to CTE because of their tragedies. Across all these examples, the pattern is the same. Individual stories are emphasized while structural causes are minimized. To summarize mainstream media framing again, CTE is usually presented as an individual case tied to personal tragedy. While this helps raise awareness, it often avoids deeper analysis of the NFL's responsibility in repeated head trauma. Solutions tend to focus on awareness, research, and diagnosis rather than structural change. This reinforces the idea that CTE is an individual medical issue rather than something created by the structure of football itself. In contrast, sociological research treats CTE as a structural issue rather than an individual one. Instead of focusing on isolated cases, sociology looks at systems and patterns from their perspective. CTE is shaped by how NFL is organized, including how decisions are made and performance are made for profit. Researchers also examine cultural expectations, especially masculinity in football. Players are often expected to be tough, ignore the pain, and keep playing through injuries. This increases exposure to repeated head trauma. From this view, CTE is not random, it is a predictable outcome of how the system is structured. Several structural factors contribute to CTE. First, it's the nature of football itself, which involves repeated head impacts over time, not just concussions, which can ultimately lead to CTE. Second is football culture, where players are encouraged to play through the pain. This is tied to masculinity and toughness. Third, early concussion protocols were weak or inconsistent or really not a thing, allowing long-term damage to build up. From 2010 to 1980, players really didn't go into concussion protocol. And then finally, economic incentives within the NFL prioritize performance and entertainment, which can slow the safety reforms. Together, these factors show CTE is not just an individual choice, but a product of a larger system. There are two main ways to understand CTE. The individual level focuses on personal stories, symptoms, and tragic outcomes. This is how mainstream media usually presents it. The structural level looks at patterns across many players and asks why CTE keeps happening. It focuses on the NFL system, repeated head trauma, and cultural expectations. The key difference is simple. One asks what happened to individuals, while the others ask why does it keep happening across the system. When it comes to solutions, mainstream media usually focuses on awareness and medical responses. This includes improving research, diagnosing players, and understanding symptoms. Sociological research, however, focuses on structural change. This includes changing rules to reduce head impacts, improving long-term safety policies, and addressing the culture of playing through injury. It also emphasizes institutional accountability, meaning responsibility lies with the organization that create the conditions for the trauma. So media focuses on reacting after harm occurs, while sociology focuses on preventing the harm in the first place. To conclude, CTE is often presented in mainstream media as a series of individual tragedies involving former NFL players. However, from a sociological perspective, it also shows a structural issue shaped by how football is played. The culture of toughness and repeated exposure head trauma leads to ultimately the problems that we have with CTE. When we combine their perspectives, it becomes clear that CTE is not just a private health issue, but it's a public issue tied to the structure of the sport itself. This changes how we think about responsibility and solutions, shifting the focus from individual cases to the system itself that produces them. That is it for my slideshow, and here are my sources.